Gettysburg was never supposed to happen, yet it would decide the fate of a nation. No grand plan brought the armies there. They were simply moving through Pennsylvania, until thousands of soldiers collided at a small crossroads. 3 days later, Robert E. Lee's greatest gamble was collapsing. But why Gettysburg, and what made this accidental battle impossible to escape? In the summer of 1863, the Confederacy believed victory was still possible. After defeating the Union at Chancellorsville, Robert E. Lee took the war north, crossing the Potomac into Pennsylvania with a dangerous plan. When a decisive victory on northern soil shake Union morale and strengthen the Confederacy's chances of survival. But while Lee was advancing, Abraham Lincoln was losing confidence in Union Commander Joseph Hooker. On June 28th, just days before the armies collided, Lincoln replaced him with Major General George G. Meade. Now Lee's army was deep inside the North, and Meade's army was racing to find it. Neither commander had chosen Gettysburg as the battlefield, but the small Pennsylvania town sat where crucial roads converged, drawing both armies toward the same point. Then, on July 1st, they collided. What began as an unexpected clash would become the largest battle ever fought on American soil, and the moment Lee's invasion of the North began to unravel. Chapter 1. The Battle Nobody Planned. The first shots came before either army had fully assembled. Gettysburg was not a fortified capital. It was a small Pennsylvania town surrounded by farmland, roads, ridges, and low hills. But its location made it strategically important. Several roads met there, creating a natural crossroads for armies moving through the region. Union cavalry under Brigadier General John Buford had arrived ahead of the main Union force. Buford was not looking for a 3-day battle. He was scouting, but from his position, he could see Confederate troops approaching from the west and north. Then he recognized the danger. The high ground south of town could determine whether the Union army fought from a position of strength or was forced to fight while exposed. The roads around Gettysburg connected the armies to the ground they needed. Buford decided to hold. His cavalrymen dismounted and formed defensive positions. They were heavily outnumbered, but they had something the approaching Confederates did not have in sufficient numbers yet: time. So when Confederate troops approached, Buford's cavalry stayed. They were badly outnumbered, and they were buying time. The first Confederate advance came from Major General Henry Haight's division of A.P. Hill's Corps. The Confederates initially expected to encounter little resistance. Instead, they found Union cavalry dug in across their path. The clash intensified. Union soldiers fought to delay the Confederate advance, while reinforcements hurried toward Gettysburg. Confederate infantry pushed toward the town. Union soldiers arrived to reinforce Buford. The fighting expanded. What had started as a clash between advance units was becoming a battle involving thousands. And with every passing hour, the question changed. Could the Union Army reinforce Gettysburg before the Confederates overwhelmed it? Then the Union position began to buckle. Confederate forces pushed the Federals back through Gettysburg. The streets became part of the battlefield. Union troops withdrew through the town as Confederate pressure increased. For a moment, it looked as though Lee had caught the Union Army before it could properly concentrate. But the Union soldiers had one advantage: the ground. They fell back toward a series of hills south of town: Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, Culp's Hill, and farther south, Little Round Top. These heights were not just geographical features. Together, they offered the Union Army a defensive position that could absorb attacks while reinforcements continued arriving. The retreat looked like defeat, but from those heights, the Union Army was forming something far more dangerous: a defensive line. More Union troops arrived during the afternoon and evening. By nightfall, the shape of the battlefield had begun to change. The Confederates had driven the Union Army from Gettysburg, but the Union Army had escaped destruction. More importantly, it had reached the high ground. Lee had won the first day, but the Union Army had secured the high ground. And now Lee faced a new question. Could he break that position before it became unbreakable? Chapter 2. The Hills That Refused to Fall. The next morning, Lee faced a Union army stretched across a powerful defensive position. The Union line curved around the hills south of Gettysburg. From Culp's Hill, across Cemetery Hill, and along Cemetery Ridge, the defenders occupied elevated ground that gave their artillery and infantry important advantages. More Union troops had arrived during the night. The army that had been retreating the previous afternoon was now concentrated. and Lee understood the danger. If the Union Army remained in this position, attacking it would become increasingly difficult. His instinct was to attack. His second-in-command, General James Longstreet, preferred a more cautious approach. Longstreet believed the Confederates should maneuver around the Union position rather than attack its strongest points directly. But Lee believed the Union Army was vulnerable. He believed an opportunity existed before the Federal position became too strong. So the attacks began, and the battlefield exploded. On the Union left, Confederate troops struck toward Little Round Top. If that position fell, the Union flank could be exposed. The rocky hill became one of the most fiercely contested points of the battle. Confederate soldiers climbed toward the Union position while defenders struggled to hold the slope. The fighting became desperate. Union soldiers were pushed toward the edge of collapse. At Little Round Top, the 20th Maine Regiment found itself fighting for survival. The regiment was positioned at the extreme left of the Union line. Its commander, Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, understood what was at stake. If Confederate troops turned the Union flank, they could threaten the entire defensive position. Confederate attacks came again and again. The defenders fought among rocks, trees, and rough ground. Then its ammunition began running dangerously low. The regiment had already endured repeated attacks. The men were exhausted. More ammunition was difficult to obtain. Retreat was becoming impossible. So Colonel Joshua Chamberlain made a decision. He ordered his men to attack. The regiment charged downhill with fixed bayonets. It was not a comfortable tactical choice. It was a desperate answer to a desperate situation. The Confederate attackers were already exhausted from repeated assaults. The sudden Union counterattack caught them at a moment when their ability to continue was weakening. The Confederate assault collapsed. Little Round Top held, but the battle was far from over. Across the field, other Union positions were being attacked. Devil's Den, the Wheat Field, the Peach Orchard, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill. Each location became another test of whether the Union line could survive. At Devil's Den, Confederate troops seized the rocky position. In the Wheat Field, control shifted repeatedly as units attacked and counterattacked. At the Peach Orchard, Union forces came under heavy pressure and were eventually driven from the position. On the Union right, Confederate forces also attacked around Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. The battle was no longer one continuous line of fighting. It was a series of brutal struggles unfolding across the landscape at the same time. For hours, the lines shifted. Fields changed hands. Men disappeared into smoke and gunfire. Orders became difficult to deliver. Units became separated. Officers struggled to see beyond the immediate fight. And soldiers who had entered the battle with full regiments watched those formations shrink around them. By nightfall, thousands were dead or wounded. Yet the Union Army still held the heights. Lee had attacked the Union line from both sides, and he had failed to break it. The Confederate Army had captured important ground, but it had not achieved the one thing Lee needed. The Union Army was still intact, and tomorrow, Lee would try to break it at its center. This documentary is based on widely accepted historical records and established scholarship about the Battle of Gettysburg. While some details, casualty figures, and interpretations may vary between historical sources, the major events, timeline, and historical significance presented here are well documented. Chapter 3: The Gamble. July 3rd began with fighting on Culp's Hill. The Confederate position there had failed to dislodge the Union defenders, and early that morning Union troops counterattacked. After hours of fighting, the Union Army regained the ground it had lost. But the real danger was somewhere else. At the center of the Union position stood Cemetery Ridge. Behind it were thousands of Union soldiers. The ridge was part of the defensive line that had survived Lee's attacks for 2 days. And now Lee believed he had found the point where the entire position could be broken. Lee believed that if he could smash through the center, the entire Union line might collapse. Longstreet disagreed. The Union position was strong. The ground between the Confederate Army and Cemetery Ridge was exposed, and the previous day's attacks had already demonstrated how difficult it was to dislodge the Union defenders. But Lee believed the center could still be vulnerable, so he ordered the attack. First came the artillery. Around 150 Confederate guns opened fire. The sound rolled across Gettysburg. The Confederate bombardment was one of the largest artillery concentrations of the battle. For more than an hour, Confederate artillery battered the Union position. Smoke covered the ridge. The Confederate guns attempted to disrupt Union artillery and weaken the defenders before the infantry advanced. From the Confederate side, the Union line became difficult to see through the smoke. Then something strange happened. The guns began to fall silent. The battlefield seemed to pause, but the silence was not the end. It was the signal for the infantry to move. Across the open fields, nearly 12,000 Confederate soldiers began moving forward. They had almost 3/4 of a mile to cross. There were fences and uneven ground, but very little meaningful protection from the Union defenders. Waiting for them were Union infantry and artillery. The soldiers kept moving. Long lines of Confederate troops advanced across the fields. Officers struggled to maintain formation as artillery and rifle fire began tearing into the ranks. Flags rose above the formations. The distance began to disappear. Then the Union guns opened. Artillery struck the advancing Confederates. Union infantry followed with concentrated rifle fire. The attack was now moving directly into the fire of a prepared defensive position. But the attack did not immediately collapse. The Confederate soldiers kept advancing. Some units reached the Union line. For a brief moment, they came dangerously close to breaking through. At a place later remembered as the Angle, Confederate soldiers reached the stone wall. The Union line shook, but it did not break. Union soldiers surged forward. The men who had reached the wall were increasingly isolated. Union reinforcements moved against them from multiple directions. The Confederate advance began to collapse. Thousands of men were killed, wounded, or captured. The survivors staggered back across the same field they had just crossed. The attack became known as Pickett's Charge, and it had failed. Lee had thrown his best chance at the Union center. The Confederate army had reached the Union line, but it could not hold it. Now his army was battered, and the Union army was still on the ridge. For Lee, the question was no longer how to win Gettysburg. It was how to get his army home. Chapter 4: The Army That Walked Away. Lee waited for a Union counterattack. It never came. Meade had won a major battle, but his army had also suffered severe losses. The Union commander now had to decide whether to pursue Lee aggressively or protect the victory he had already secured. The Confederate army began preparing to withdraw. Wounded soldiers filled the roads. Wagons carried men who could no longer march. The Confederate retreat would stretch toward the Potomac River and Virginia. On July 4th, Lee's battered forces started moving toward Virginia. The invasion of the North was over, but Gettysburg had come at an enormous cost. About 23,000 Union soldiers became casualties. The Confederate losses were roughly 28,000. More than 50,000 men had been killed, wounded, captured, or gone missing in 3 days. Those numbers represented entire communities changed by the battle. Some soldiers would never return. Others would carry physical wounds for the rest of their lives. Families would wait for news. And the people living around Gettysburg would inherit the immediate consequences of a battle they had never planned to witness. The dead had to be buried. The wounded had to be treated. And the land itself had been transformed by 3 days of combat. And the consequences reached far beyond the battlefield. Lee's army had failed to destroy the Army of the Potomac. It had failed to win a decisive victory in the North. Instead, it was retreating. The army that had crossed into Pennsylvania with confidence was now trying to escape back into Virginia. And after Gettysburg, Lee never again launched another major invasion of Northern territory on the scale of the 1863 campaign. At almost the same moment, another Confederate stronghold was collapsing. On July 4th, Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg, Mississippi. The city had endured a long siege. Its surrender gave the Union control of the Mississippi River and divided the Confederacy geographically. The timing was striking. Gettysburg stopped Lee's invasion in the east. Vicksburg delivered another major Union victory in the west. 2 Confederate setbacks had arrived almost simultaneously. The war was not over. The Confederacy was still capable of fighting, but the balance had shifted. The Union had stopped Lee's invasion while Grant's victory at Vicksburg delivered another major strategic blow. And months later, Gettysburg would become the place where Abraham Lincoln gave that shift a meaning far larger than the battle itself. Closing reflection. On November 19, 1863, Lincoln stood at Gettysburg to dedicate the soldiers' national cemetery. He spoke for only a few minutes, but he transformed the meaning of the battlefield. Gettysburg had been fought over roads, hills, positions, and military advantage. Lincoln connected those deaths to a larger question. Could a nation built around the idea of liberty survive a war that had exposed the deepest contradictions within it? That is what makes Gettysburg more than a battle. The soldiers who fought there could not know what their deaths would mean decades later. They knew only that they had to hold a position, cross a field, follow an order, or survive until nightfall. For the men on Cemetery Ridge, the future was not history. It was the next minute. For the men crossing the fields during Pickett's charge, the outcome was not yet written. For the families waiting at home, victory and defeat were measured in names that returned and names that did not. History often looks inevitable after it happens, but to the people living through it, the outcome was never guaranteed. Gettysburg reminds us that turning points are rarely obvious while they are happening. They are created by decisions made under pressure, by courage, by mistakes, by uncertainty, and sometimes by thousands of ordinary people caught inside events far larger than themselves. The Civil War would continue for nearly 2 more years. But at Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee's invasion had failed, and the direction of the war had changed. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to Mode Hub Tales as we uncover the forgotten histories, hidden cultures, and untold stories that shaped our world. Because history doesn't disappear, it waits to be remembered.